Alastor opens his eyes before the world even understands what has returned, and this time there is no fire, no chaos, no throne waiting for him. Just a quiet room, dim light, and the fragile body of a newborn. Yet inside that small body sits the full weight of everything he once was, and everything he already knows will happen, because he remembers it all. Hell, the screams, the deals, the absolute control he held as the radio demon, and beyond that he carries something far more dangerous, the future itself. Every trend, every shift in power, every rise and fall of influence in this new world. And in that moment he does not panic, he does not question, he simply accepts. Because to him this is not a second chance, it is a better stage. And so he cries on cue, perfectly playing the role expected of him while already planning 10 steps ahead, growing year by year in silence, watching, learning, dissecting human behavior with surgical precision, as he realizes quickly that this world is not weaker than hell. It is simply disguised. Power still exists. It just hides behind systems, attention, perception, and influence. And by the time he reaches childhood, he already understands how to bend conversations, how to gain trust, how to guide outcomes with nothing but tone and timing. And when he finally encounters the internet, everything clicks into place instantly because he sees it for what it truly is. Not entertainment, but the largest broadcast system ever created. A network of endless ears waiting for a voice strong enough to command them. And he smiles because radio never died, it evolved, and now it has no limits. So he waits, because he knows rushing is what lesser minds do. And when the time is right, he begins, small at first. Anonymous uploads, controlled audio, subtle distortions, content that feels just slightly off in a way people cannot explain yet cannot ignore. And slowly the audience builds, not through noise but through precision, because he does not aim for everyone. He aims for the ones who stay, the ones who listen twice, the ones who feel something they cannot name. And as he grows older, he expands into video, into presence, into identity, revealing just enough to anchor the voice to a face while keeping the mystery intact. And his growth accelerates rapidly because he already knows what works and what fails before anyone else learns it. Avoiding mistakes before they even appear, scaling multiple channels, multiple personas, controlling different streams of influence at once, while no one realizes they all lead back to him. And by the time he reaches adulthood, he has already rebuilt himself into something larger than he ever was in hell. Not a demon ruling through fear, but a presence embedded into attention itself. Millions listening, millions following, not because they are forced, but because they choose to. And that is where he finds something new, something stronger. Because control, given willingly, roots deeper than control taken by force. So he builds systems around that, communities, private spaces, layers of connection where people feel seen, understood, selected. And through that he shapes behavior, habits, thought patterns, not directly but subtly, guiding instead of commanding. And as his influence spreads beyond his own platforms into media, business, and even political structures, he becomes something almost invisible. Not because he hides, but because he blends into the fabric of everything. His voice echoing through trends, narratives, and decisions without ever being traced back to a single source. And at that point he realizes something critical. This world is better than hell, because in hell power is loud and challenged directly, but here power is quiet and rarely questioned. Yet despite all of this, something begins to shift. Small inconsistencies in the future he remembers, events unfolding differently, outcomes changing, timelines bending, and he understands immediately that his presence is altering the very path he once knew, introducing uncertainty for the first time in a long time. And instead of resisting it, he studies it, adapts to it, because change is simply another variable to control. But alongside that, something else begins to develop within him. Something unexpected, not weakness, not morality, but perspective. Because for the first time he interacts with resistance that does not break easily. Individuals who question, who push back, who do not fall into his patterns. And instead of crushing them like he would have in hell, he observes them, analyzes them, finding value in the unpredictability they bring. And this shifts his approach, making him more refined, more calculated, understanding that the strongest form of control is not dominance but alignment, where people move in the direction he wants because they believe it was their own choice. And by the time he reaches the peak of his new existence, he has surpassed what he once was. No throne, no title, no need for fear, just a voice that commands attention across an entire world, shaping systems, influencing decisions, guiding millions without ever raising his tone. And yet within that quiet dominance, a single thought lingers in the background of his mind. Not regret, not doubt, but curiosity. Because, after everything he has rebuilt, and everything he now controls, he begins to wonder what happens when a being like him, one who once ruled through absolute certainty, is placed into a world that constantly shifts, constantly resists, constantly evolves. And for the first time since his rebirth, he does not have an immediate answer. So instead he does what he has always done best. He continues, he adapts, he watches. And when he speaks again, the world listens, not knowing that the voice guiding them has already lived this game once before, and intends to master it completely this time. The shift does not stop. It spreads. Small deviations turn into patterns, and patterns turn into fractures in the future he once knew, forcing Alastor to rebuild his understanding from the ground up, not as a spectator with foresight, but as an active force inside the system. And this is where things become interesting to him again, because predictability was never the end goal. Control was, and control in a changing system requires something more refined than memory. It requires adaptation at a level no ordinary mind can sustain. So he begins constructing new models, tracking behavior across millions of people, measuring response times, engagement cycles, emotional triggers, mapping out how influence moves through digital space like currents in an ocean. And within months, he regains his edge, not by relying on what will happen, but by shaping what does happen. And this time he does it faster, cleaner, more efficiently than before, tightening his grip without ever appearing to hold anything at all. Yet the more he expands, the more resistance he encounters, not from institutions or governments, but from individuals. Creators who refuse to follow trends, voices that rise without his guidance, anomalies in the system that do not respond to his influence the way others do. And instead of eliminating them, he watches closely, because they represent something valuable, unpredictability. And unpredictability, when understood, becomes leverage. So he studies them, learns their patterns, not to crush them, but to integrate them, slowly aligning their paths with his own without them realizing it, turning opposition into extension. And through this, he builds something far more complex than simple dominance. He builds an ecosystem, one where every major flow of attention either starts with him or passes through something he has already shaped. And by the time this structure stabilizes, he reaches a new level of control, one that no longer depends on constant input, because the system now sustains itself, growing, adapting, and reinforcing his influence even when he is silent. And that silence becomes his next tool. He begins disappearing at intervals, stepping away from direct communication, while his presence continues to echo through the networks he has built, creating anticipation, tension, demand. And when he returns, the impact is amplified tenfold, each appearance calculated, each word measured, each pause intentional, and people respond exactly as expected. Engagement spikes, loyalty deepens, influence spreads further. But beneath this perfect execution, something continues to develop within him, something he cannot ignore. Because despite having rebuilt his power and surpassed his former self, there is a difference he cannot erase. In hell, he was feared. Here he is followed. And that distinction begins to matter in ways he did not anticipate. Because fear creates distance, but attention creates connection. And connection introduces variables he cannot fully control. Emotions, expectations, dependence. And for the first time, he starts to see the cost of influence at this scale. Not in terms of effort or risk, but in terms of consequence. Because every shift he creates ripples outward into real lives, real outcomes, real changes that extend beyond his immediate view. And while this does not trouble him in a moral sense, it forces him to adjust his calculations, because unintended outcomes are still outcomes, and outcomes must be accounted for. So he refines again, narrowing his focus, increasing precision, reducing unnecessary variables, shaping influence in ways that produce cleaner, more predictable results. Yet even with this refinement, the system continues to evolve beyond his original expectations. Because people begin adapting to him, learning his patterns, predicting his behavior, creating a feedback loop where influence is no longer one-directional, but interactive. And this pushes him into a new phase entirely. One where he must stay ahead, not just of trends, but of the very audience he has shaped, constantly evolving his methods, changing his approach, introducing new layers of complexity to maintain his position at the top. And this constant evolution keeps him engaged in a way he has not felt since his earliest days in hell. Because now the game is no longer about reaching control, it is about maintaining it in a system that refuses to stay still. And as years pass, he expands even further, moving beyond media into infrastructure, technology, data systems, quietly positioning himself at key points where information flows can be influenced at scale, not just through content, but through the systems that distribute it. And at this level, his presence becomes almost impossible to define, because he is no longer just a creator or a voice. He is part of the framework itself, shaping how information moves, how attention is directed, how narratives form and dissolve. And yet, despite all of this, despite reaching a level of influence that surpasses anything he once held in hell, the question remains, growing louder over time, not out of doubt but out of curiosity. What happens when a system this large begins to push back? Not through individuals, but through structure itself. Because systems tend to resist centralized control. They fragment, they decentralize, they evolve in ways that reduce dependency on any single point. And as he observes these early signs, he understands that the next phase is approaching. One where control must become even more subtle, even more integrated. No longer about guiding from above, but about embedding influence so deeply within the system that it cannot be separated from it. And this is where his focus shifts entirely, away from visibility, away from identity, toward permanence, building structures that do not rely on his presence to function, shaping behaviors and patterns that persist even in his absence. And as he works toward this goal, he begins to withdraw again, not as a tactic this time, but as a transition, reducing his direct appearances, limiting his voice, allowing the systems he built to operate independently while he moves behind the scenes. And in this space, removed from constant interaction, he begins to reflect in a way he never has before, not on his actions or his outcomes, but on the nature of control itself. Because for all his power, all his influence, all his success, he recognizes a truth that remains constant across both lives. Control is never absolute. It is always temporary, always shifting, always dependent on variables that cannot be fully contained. And instead of rejecting this, he accepts it, not as a limitation, but as a defining feature of the system. Because a system that cannot be fully controlled is one that can always be played, and as long as it can be played, it can be mastered. And with that understanding, he steps forward into the next phase of his existence. Not as the radio demon reborn, not as a creator, not as a hidden force behind systems, but as something beyond all of those roles, a constant within change, a voice that no longer needs to be heard to be followed. And as the world continues to evolve around him, shifting, adapting, growing more complex with each passing moment, he remains at its center, not by force, not by fear, but by design, still watching, still learning, still guiding, and somewhere within that quiet control, that endless adaptation, that perfect balance between presence and absence, the smile remains unchanged. Because for Alastor, the game never ends, it only becomes more interesting.